John McWhorter.
Hey Glenn, how are you?
I'm doing well. This is the Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv. I'm sitting here with John McWhorter of Columbia University, and I am, of course, Glenn Loury. We are, John, self-appointed black guys at bloggingheads.tv. And our subject for today is race and urban politics and identity,
That's
prompted
right.
by this mayoral contest in Newark, New Jersey, that David Brooks wrote about in his column last week.
hmm
You want to set us up by describing what the situation is and what the issues are there?
Well, basically, what seems to be going on in Newark is a kind of repeat of some similar tensions that we saw in the early time of the previous decade between Sharp James, who ended up running Newark for about 20 years, and Cory Booker, who was seen as the young upstart. And one rhetorical challenge that Cory Booker received, which now Shavar Jeffries is receiving as well, is that he is not black enough to be a viable candidate for running a black city like Newark. That to be a real black person, you're not supposed to, for example, have a high quality Ivy League education. You're not supposed to be somebody who has a comfort zone that includes the world outside of what is called the black community. And Cory Booker took it from Sharp James, and he ended up becoming a victor after a first failed attempt to take over the city. And now we're seeing the same thing between Jeffries and Ross Baraka, whose idea is that his genesis and his roots are such that he's the real Newark, he's the real Black America, while Jeffries is some sort of outsider whose claim to be a representative of Black people is somehow fraught. Is that a good summary of what's going on?
That's certainly a big piece of it. Okay, so Cory Booker, who is now Senator Cory Booker, representing the state of New Jersey, and who is on, an upswing. I think one has to say his stock is definitely headed up politically. Came in. Now, what was his background? Yale Law School, if I don't mistake that.
He had gone
Corey.
to Stanford and he was a Rhodes Scholar. I forget where he went to law school.
I think it was Yale, but in any case, an Ivy League law school, Stanford University College, a Rhodes Scholar, a brilliant young, I might also observe, light complected
Yeah.
African American, and came head to head with the machine politician and some say corrupt machine politician, Sharp James,
Darker
and
skinned, for
and
example.
thought to be more authentic by many of the people living in public housing projects and tenements and working for minimum wage or unemployed or in and out of prison or long-term black residents of Newark who thought if we're going to have somebody represent us, we want it not to be one of these Ivy League, gilded upper crust black people. We want it to be, quote, someone like us, close quote. And
Right.
that history is kind of cycling back again because this candidate Shavar Jeffries also has a Ivy League pedigree, does he not?
hmm And here he is going through exactly the same. And I wouldn't even call it a matter of an initiation. It's not a kind of hazing. I think these are very deeply felt ideas about who is the better person. It really is personal.
Now tell us
And
about the other candidate. Ross Baraka is, if I again am not mistaken, the son of the recently deceased Amiri
Amiri Baraka,
Baraka,
that's right.
the poet
hmm
and
Radical, political
politically
radical.
radical thinker and writer, very prominent in literary circles as well, a
hmm
figure. So
hmm
so he's like old school, authentic Black Newark,
And has
and
not had the most positive relations with Cory Booker. And so, yeah, he represents what you might call the old way. And he's somebody who feels that maybe we would benefit from going back to the old way with the people who are really of the place and can really get some things done.
so what's the problem with that?
Well, you know what I think of that whole discussion, and it's interesting. what happened between Booker and James? That was a long time ago now. All of that was going on 15 years ago, and I thought of it as the twilight of that sort of identity mess. Actually, Barack Obama went through the same kind of thing with Bobby Rush in Illinois before he became president, but he did become president. And I thought that maybe the discourse in the black community had moved beyond that, partly because of Cory Booker's success. You can't say that he turned Newark upside down, but he didn't exactly make a fool of himself. But now here we are, and what's interesting is very simply this. There's this idea among a certain kind of person that if you have an Ivy League education and you are comfortable with white people as a black person, and that if you don't talk in a certain way, that it must be that your allegiance is not with black people. You went off into this other world and you developed other interests and other commitments. So you couldn't really care about us because you're too busy reading about Plato and hanging out with people who aren't like us. When actually, the truth is, it's almost the opposite. The better educated you are as a black American person in today's America, the more likely you are, I think, to develop a sophisticated understanding of how inequality and racism works in this society. And the sort of person who's been through Harvard and Yale and is a Rhodes Scholar, et cetera, who's black, who comes out of it not concerned with what they often consider the people who are left behind, that's the exception. And I'm not sure how many people like that Ross Baraka has met, at least in the past 25 or 30 years. It's
Okay,
just this way, I'm just very quickly, it's this way of thinking that seems to just sit as a kind of routine rather than an engagement with current reality.
well, let's expand on this a little bit. So you mentioned Barack Obama and Bobby Rush.
Hmm.
Obama ran for the seat in Congress that Bobby Rush occupied. Do
Hmm.
I get that correct? And
Hmm.
lost in a primary contest, a Democratic primary contest for representing that district in Chicago in a
This is an
campaign
'04, I think, yeah.
in a campaign in which Bobby Rush, that's Bobby Rush of the uh, from the 60s and 70s when he was a radical Black Panther Party member. Do I get this correct? In any case, he had
Yeah.
a pedigree of radicalism, and he'd been doing ward
Glenn,
politics.
very, very quickly, are we, and I mean we, because are we confusing him with Bobby Seale when we say the Panther part? I just want to make sure.
Yeah, we might be confusing him, and let me back off from that because I'm not sure about
Yeah,
that,
I'm not, but still,
and it could be
that
looked
kind of
up.
politics. Yeah.
Okay, radical African American in Chicago, and if you like, he played the race card against Barack Obama in that campaign. He said
Hmm.
Obama is not authentically black. He says you don't want some kind of carpetbagging half white, practically. I don't know if I quote him saying that, but that was the implicit message.
Right.
A fellow representing you, you want me. You know me. I'm of you. I'm with you. I'm a real black man. This kind of
Hmm.
idea. Now,
Right.
here's what I want to ask you. Peter Beinart,
Hmm.
the writer, has a book out about Zionism, which has a chapter in it that is entitled um, "The First Jewish President" or something
Hmm.
like that, in which he details in this chapter. Peter Beinart does Barack Obama's relationship with prominent Jewish activists and political figures and business leaders around Chicago.
Hmm.
And he basically says, in so many words, that Obama's views about, in this particular case, the Israel Palestine conflict and the interest of the American Jewish community were shaped by his interactions with these people. And he goes on to say how close Obama was to some of them. Now,
Hmm.
here's where I'm going with that, okay? And I don't want to be misunderstood. Suppose you were sitting on the south side of Chicago and you knew
Hmm.
that this fellow who was running to represent you actually had very close relationships and, sort of intimate connections with, in terms of friendship, financial, intellectual, political, people whom you thought were not of your community. In this particular case, the example is people from the North Shore of Chicago,
Hmm.
who were well heeled, well connected, powerful, and members of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee.
Hmm.
Suppose you knew that. Now, if someone came along and said he's black, but he's not really black, and by that what I mean is he doesn't really have your interest in heart, because if you look deeply, the figures who are behind the scenes who have the greatest influence on him are not people like Jeremiah Wright, people whom you know and love and you've known for 30 or 40 years, but they're people like, and then we could name some people
Hmm.
who live up on the North Shore, who run big hotel chains, or who are retail magnates or investment bankers, and who have a set of interests all their own. And if you want to know who's going to really have the ear of your candidate,
Hmm.
then look there. Don't look around a housing project. Don't look at people who are community organizers. Don't look at
Hmm.
people who are union leaders who've been living in your community. Don't look there. Look north and look over the fence on the other side of the fence to people who are nothing
Hmm.
like you. Now, I say all of that to say this. What's wrong with objecting to a candidate whom you feel is inauthentic, not in terms of some abstract notion of
Right.
blackness, not abstract blackness,
Right.
inauthentic in the sense that what really moves them
Uh-huh.
and who really has their ear and the forces in our society to which they are really responding are not the things that are nearest and dearest to your own heart. What would be wrong with that?
What would be wrong with that is that it's self-defeating and it's ahistorical. Very simply, anybody who's going to make a real difference in the black community today is going to have the ear of some white people, and it would help if a lot of them are rich. That's not the way I wish that it were. That's the way that it just happens to be. Now, if you have some sort of black nationalist fantasy that the black community is going to somehow pool its resources and take care of itself, I understand why that might be attractive, but I think you and I both know that people have been talking about that for 45, 50 years, really 100. But in terms of the current kind of ideology that we're familiar with, that's a long old story and it doesn't seem to be working out. And it seems to me that if you're talking about black leaders, especially ones of a certain vintage, they really ought to understand that real change certainly happens when you break bread with the powers that be, including ones that you might not think of as caring all that deeply about black people. Suppose Martin Luther King had decided that the black community was going to take care of itself. And for people who think that Malcolm X was more important, what they really mean is that he was more interesting. What was actually coming out of it, except for some feelings? And so, as far as I'm concerned, somebody might say that well, this person is going to be more interested in what goes on with people from the north, but people in the northern part of the city. But as long as that person has demonstrated what seems like a sincere interest in the black community in the same time, and Barack Obama had certainly done that with his community organizing work, then it seems to me that saying who's really going to have his ear is just a matter of creating division or spreading some sort of fantastical notion that anybody who's really going to make a difference is not going to be comfortable with and not going to be good at seeking money from rich white people. It just doesn't make sense. Wouldn't you
Okay.
agree?
Well, I'd agree that there's nothing wrong with having contacts outside of the community. And I agree that an effective leader of an ethnic community like African Americans will in part be effective precisely because he or she is able to raise money from and able to, have influence with people who are not themselves black or who are not themselves poor. So there is nothing wrong with being well connected and there's nothing wrong with being well financed. The question, though, might arise in the mind of a voter: can I trust this person?
Mm-hmm.
Are they merely using me and their blackness and our
Mm-hmm.
black community on behalf of a program of their own personal ambition
Mm-hmm.
and or on behalf of a set of political objectives which are not consistent with my own values and my own interests? And I think that that's a judgment. I mean, I think that if a person thought anybody who throws Jeremiah Wright under the bus is not somebody that I can trust to represent the interest of black people when the doors are closed and a lot of money is on the table.
Mm-hmm.
A person not crazy for thinking that. That might be a perfectly legitimate point of view. But
Yeah, but
anyway,
who are they comparing that person to?
all
So
right,
who's done a better job? And
right.
so let's say that they say, well, I can't trust this person. So is somebody supposed to trust sort of local congressperson elected around 1979 who basically has just kept everybody treading water for the past 25 years? We all know the sort of person that we're talking about. Is that somehow better? Because unless somebody can answer that question, then it seems to me that we're coming down to what you seem to want to kind of step around for the time being, which is it's a matter of identity. It's not
No,
only
no,
who.
I don't want to. I don't want to avoid that. Let's come to that. But if you ask me, Bobby Rush or Barack Obama, who
Mm-hmm.
would be a better representative of that district on the south side of Chicago that has to be represented in Congress, it's not obvious to me
Mm-hmm.
that the answer is Barack Obama. I'm not taking a
At that
position.
time, yeah.
At that time, I'm just saying I don't know that Bobby Rush is a bad congressman or whatever. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so I grant that. If you ask me whether or not Sharp James or Cory Booker would have or did do a better and more effective job being mayor of Newark, I don't think that's a close call. I think Cory Booker, from what I know of it, was honest, was present, was not corrupt, was an effective administrator, had some vision, had some personal courage, cared about
Mm-hmm.
the job, and I believe did a pretty good job as mayor of Newark. There are objective measures, but it looks to me like he was a better candidate.
It
And
didn't
if
get
you're
worse.
and yeah, and if you're asking me whether or not this fellow Shavar
Jeffries.
Jeffries, whom I don't know, should be presumptively disqualified because he doesn't fit the identity template of being
Mm-hmm.
authentically black, I would say no, he ought not to be. We ought to look at the objective, evidence such as it is, and were the reading of that evidence to come out, Ross Baraka versus Shavar Jeffries. Shavar Jeffries is my choice. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised at that. He shouldn't be disqualified because of his identity. I was only trying to say that considerations of authenticity, trust, and who are you really representing, just because you show up with the same skin color as mine, just because you can give a good speech, should I trust you to have my interest at heart when the doors are closed? I was just trying to say that I don't think that those are silly or illegitimate concerns that people can have about,
But
a
no,
politician of
no,
color.
formally no, Glenn. But still, the fact is, if there's some candidate who looks a certain way in terms of skin tone, probably darker, who talks a certain way, in other words, has at least a certain amount of Ebonic cadence, and can tell some stories about having grown up somewhere that was less than ideal with parents who worked very hard at thankless jobs, and somebody who can make a certain kind of noise, a certain kind of music, that person. How often would the same people who will look at somebody like Barack Obama with the intelligent kind of distrust you're talking about look at that sharp Jamesy or Bobby Rushy person and say, no, I can't trust them? The trust, and I'm not talking about only the least educated, even among the educated people, the trust seems to come immediately based on issues of cadence and background, etc. There are all sorts of untrustworthy things that people like that have often done, and they often get elected year after year after year. Whereas if somebody comes along who doesn't have those advantages, their father did not drive a bus, they are not dark skinned, they don't sound a certain way when they talk, they don't refer to Motown songs, etc., etc., then with them all of a sudden everybody gets very analytical. That bothers me. How come it's the sharp James can get by just by being ebonic? It's a problem.
Okay, there's a problem there, and by the way, it's a problem that is not limited to African American constituencies.
By
I
no
can I
means.
can imagine some urban ethnic constituencies, whether they be Irish or
Oh, same thing. Yeah.
Jewish or Italian or Greek or
Yeah,
Slavic or
we're talking
whatever,
human. Yeah.
would have had that circle the wagons around our guy or our gal.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's one of ours who's gone over and doesn't speak with the same twang that we speak with, and
Mm-hmm.
wears a certain kind of suit that I'm not familiar with, and doesn't feel
Exactly.
comfortable in the church that I go to, and
Mm-hmm.
so forth, we don't trust them. And I'm sure there are words for who these Uncle Tom like figures
Lace curtain
are.
Irish
Yeah,
was the term.
exactly. This
Yep.
kind of thing. Okay, I'm sure that
Mm-hmm.
that's that goes on. So, I mean, let me tell you a story. Elizabeth Warren is one of my
Mm-hmm.
senators. I live in Massachusetts, and she's
Mm-hmm.
the senator, one of the senators representing the state of Massachusetts. She has, I've seen her now 3 times in the church that I attend. She doesn't attend every Sunday by any means, but she's friendly with the pastor and she comes there.
Mm-hmm.
She has spoken on a couple of the occasions that I've been there briefly to the congregation. Man, I'm telling you, she feels so comfortable standing up in front of a group of Christian believers with a Bible in her hand, talking about how her faith informs her service, that you can't help but love her
Mm-hmm.
if you're a Christian. Okay, I mean, if you're a Christian in that particular congregation at
Mm-hmm.
that particular moment, just about everybody's a Democrat around there, and they're going to all mostly vote Democratic, whatever. But the authentic feel of watching her
Yeah.
comfortably profess her faith just
Yeah.
had a kind of, you know, elevating impact. on a lot of the people who would have seen that. They would have
I
said,
didn't know that about her. That's
that's
interesting.
somebody whom we can trust. That's somebody who we know that she has to raise a gazillion dollars to run, and we know that most of the meetings that she goes to will be with well-heeled, powerful figures and this and that. But nevertheless, we think she's not going to forget us when she gets inside that room. This kind of idea. So
Sure.
I'm not, no brief for Elizabeth Warren, just to illustrate the idea that authenticity is a legitimate thing about which a person trying to say whom they're going to support politically could be concerned.
I would say it's a powerful thing because, to be perfectly honest, that aspect of Elizabeth Warren, that's great. But to the extent that anybody would use that aspect of her and feel it as a reason to trust her more. If you think about it, Glenn, that doesn't make any kind of logical sense. That's all about the gut, once again, even though it's about God and Jesus. She could be somebody who was very comfortable talking about those sorts of things and sell everybody right down the river, regardless, as we've seen plenty of deeply Christian do to people of all colors, shapes, and sizes. So no,
No.
I see what you mean. It is powerful. Authenticity matters a lot, but I'm mad at it. And certainly I'm mad at it partly because I am so often called unauthentic. I
No.
openly admit it. But yeah, it's not, it is the gut rather than the head, and it gets all sorts of people in an awful lot of trouble.
Okay, duly noted. Your proviso, your warning, duly noted. I simply want to observe. I think in politics, there's no getting away from the need not only to use the head, but
Hmm.
also to use the gut. Here's what I'm getting at: this idea that I need to ask myself, where is the speaker, the advocate, the would-be representative coming from? Okay,
Hmm.
I hear what they say, but where are they coming from? Because I know that they have an interest to tell me what I want to hear. Okay,
Hmm.
so I know that guile is an inescapable element of the process of political communication. Stage setting,
Hmm.
framing. That it's all about trying to move me in one way or another.
Hmm.
So when I'm looking at this person who's speaking to me, of course I'm listening to what they say. I'm reading their briefs, their position papers, or whatever. I'm looking at their voting record. I'm thinking, but I'm also asking myself, it's an ad hominem question. Okay. Not something that would legitimately be a part of a formal, logical, deductive decision making process, but something that I don't think you can avoid when you're going into a voting booth. You have to ask yourself, who is this person? What kind of
Sure.
person am I grappling? Not just what the logic of it is, but the gut of it is certainly a part of it too, right? I mean,
Oh, it has to be because we're
yeah.
all human beings. And I shouldn't say that I am immune to the authenticity fetish. You can't always think with your head. We can't help but view a person partly on the basis of whether or not we would like to hang out with them or whether or not we feel that, as you say, they're coming from a good place. I think that I feel like David Brooks, it's our job as people to understand that that can be taken too far. And I think it's the nature of politics, partly because it's showbiz, partly because, let's face it, most of any populists are not going to be political wonks reading the New Republic. And that's just part of being human, too, that you end up having to go for the gut to an unhealthy extent, such that, for example, today, with the nature of the media, a person who's unpleasant to look at will have a hard time getting high in public office. I mean, that's a relatively innocent aspect of it. But
That's
yeah,
a good
all these
example,
things are
though.
real.
No, the example is very good. If you're short, if you're fat,
Hmm.
if you're ugly,
Hmm.
you know,
Let's face it.
um, you
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 know,
know, people are going to discount that to a certain extent. That's going to hurt you, no matter how clever you are, no matter how cogent you are. It's going to hurt you, and I don't see any way around that.
no, that's just called what humanity is. But there are aspects of humanity that I think make us all angry. And to me, that authenticity idea, and especially if you're a black person and a black person of a certain time and place, it's dangerous. It's dangerous stuff. And
You're not alone, John. I've been called Uncle Tom on more than one occasion. I mean,
yeah,
I've
but you
even been
can
called.
always say that you grew up on the south side of Chicago, whereas I
That's
grew up
true.
in Mount Airy, Philadelphia. And so I can, and my father did not drive a bus, etc. And so I'm not trying to compare Holocausts, but you
No,
can
no, no,
always say that.
no. You're right, and I have had to say it on occasion. I've had to make use of it in order to maintain my legitimacy, my bona fides in certain company. I've had to say, no, you can't
Out black
uh,
me.
out ghetto me. You cannot out ghetto me. I know people went to jail. People I went to high school with got shot to death before they were 20 years old. Blah blah blah. You
Hmm.
can't out ghetto me. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Anybody can
anyway,
out ghetto me. But
talking of ghettos,
yeah, good
since
transition.
we have a few minutes here, what's up with this fight that I hear going on in Brooklyn? I hear some people, longtime African American residents of Brooklyn, are trying to block a whole food store from being opened up or built because they don't want the gentrification of their neighborhood to go too far. They're complaining about the fact that white people are moving into the neighborhood, buying up property, making it look nice, bringing it something from a trash strewn, derelicts hanging out, too high crime rate street to a lot of 30 something urban pioneers wanting to, redo their brownstones and put their track lighting and their hardwood floors and their granite top kitchens and so forth. And what's wrong with progress? How is it
Oh,
that
Lord.
people are against, or am I wrong? Is white people moving into the neighborhood and making the houses look nice not progress as it would appear to be?
Oh yeah, yeah. I entered into this a couple weeks ago for a piece for Time where I complained about Spike Lee, who went into a kind of spontaneous, profanity-laden rant
Yeah, give
against
us the
the
background on this so that we're all on the same page.
Fort Greene is a neighborhood that was somewhat like what you are describing. I wouldn't say that it was a war zone or anything like that, but Fort Greene was a neighborhood with a very strong black and brown presence, which, say, 20 years ago, white people would not have generally chosen to move into. And this is Spike Lee's old neighborhood. And
Okay.
now it's gentrifying in the classic way, and so it's becoming more like what often comes up here in New York is Park Slope in Brooklyn. And so the stereotypical vision is the usually white mother with a baby carriage and the Starbucks, et cetera, et cetera. So it's becoming very much not the kind of neighborhood that Spike Lee so beautifully lights and shoots in a lot of his movies, or at least used to. And Spike Lee doesn't like it. And I can see why he doesn't like it in a talk about the gut again in a visceral sense. The neighborhood he grew up in, the community that he grew up in, is coming to no longer exist because you've got all these different people, and the different people are whites who are richer and they're buying out black residents, giving them, $1 million+ for their home. So it's not like people are being kicked out and moving into housing projects, but
Wow.
they're leaving. And now you've got these white people in, and of course, white people are representatives of a class that has a certain guilt on its hands, and he doesn't like it. He sees it, and what he sees is a bunch of the enemy coming into his neighborhood. That's
Okay,
not
now
crazy.
now he's not alone in this. He's a prominent spokesperson on behalf of a view that I gather is more widely held amongst residents of that community.
Oh yeah, and people who don't live in it. It is considered educated to look at that and think of it as a bad thing.
I suppose if you own one of these brownstones that yesterday was worth 350,000 and today is worth 1.2 million, you don't have such a
Hmm.
problem with
No,
that.
no, the black people, this isn't Robert Moses, mowing down neighborhoods and leaving black people to fend for themselves. There's some black people who are pretty happy because they have this money or they can pass it on to their kids. But still, the result is that his old neighborhood, and I can imagine how it would feel if my old neighborhood changed in some way. I don't like it when they cut down a tree in my old neighborhood. In his neighborhood, now it's no longer Mrs. Collins down the street and Mr. Washington over on the corner. Now it's becoming this place that he barely recognizes. And he feels like his people have been basically pushed out and that the culture is leaving, that there was a culture, there was something that had taken root in Fort Greene
Yeah.
that's being dispersed.
Well, there was a culture. I mean, low case C, but there would have been, right? There would have
Hmm.
been a way of living, a
A
kind
way of
of
doing a rhythm, yeah.
feel or flavor or rhythm to life in the community that will be changed.
Hmm.
Um, if you're a renter and you're now receiving, in effect, an eviction notice, property has changed hands, your lease expires at the December 31st. We would appreciate it if you be out of the apartment. Now
Hmm.
you got to find another place to live, or whatever. I mean, you've been displaced in a way. I can understand why that might feel bad to
Hmm.
people. If you
Hmm.
felt neglected, no one ever gave a darn about our community, trash didn't get picked up on time, you call the cops or an ambulance for emergency service and they take 3 hours to get here. We had basically got no attention in City Hall. We were always on the bottom of things. And then some well educated and well heeled white people begin to move in, and suddenly bus service is different, trash collection is different, City Hall is responsive,
Hmm.
stories in the newspaper talking about how good things are going. I can understand that that might be just another reminder of your marginal status within the society as a whole and how you might feel that, well, I at least have my own community and these people are
Right,
trying to take that away from me. So
right.
I can see why people might have a bad feeling about
Sure,
progress because it reminds them of the fact that they're yet again being left behind, this kind of a thing.
right. And then the question comes up, though. And it's interesting, some of the responses I got to the piece that I wrote in Time. Really, and I mean really interesting. The question that comes up is, how would you rather it have gone? And my sense is that nobody would rather have a neighborhood like Fort Greene stayed what you might call raggedy. There were too many problems. That's not what anybody wanted it to be like. But what people seem like they would want, although I don't think most people are walking around thinking of it in this way, but the idea is that it would have been black people who were buying up these houses. That the idea is that it would have become a multi-class black community. And so what really sticks in many people's craw is that it's white people coming in and buying out these black people and giving them money. When really it would be better if in our society there were enough affluent black people to come in and be the ones doing that so that Fort Greene becomes a better black place. And I can see how people might like that. But my problem with it is that really, if it's a black place, if it's this black multi-class neighborhood, and this is something I've written about elsewhere, if that emerged in 2014, that would be because of segregation. If there are black neighborhoods like that, it means that there's some reason that black people want to be with each other rather than with the whites, and the whites would rather the black people perhaps be there. If we're getting past racism, if we're supposed
Uh,
to, then we want mixed neighborhoods, I would think. No?
no, sure. We want mixed neighborhoods. That would be my view. And we want to move beyond segregation. That would be my
Mm-hmm.
view. I mean, there's a larger argument here. I think for African Americans, integration, by which I mean a complete kind of blending in at every level, not just residential, not just in the schools, is the
Mm-hmm.
only way to go for the long term. But that's a separate, that's a separate conversation. The thing I wanted to say is I'm not sure that if these were well-heeled black people, the complaints that you're talking about would be silenced, because I'm not sure that it's not class instead of race
Mm-hmm.
that's the most important thing. And here's another way of looking at it. Gentrification is good, okay? It's good for the city
Mm-hmm.
if tax-paying, stably employed, property keeping up oriented, family oriented individuals and couples come into a community. That's got to
Mm-hmm.
be good, not bad. Seeing a Starbucks open has got to be good, not bad. Seeing a Whole Foods open or anything else, a market on the corner, that's seeing the commercial strip on the avenue starting to become alive with shops that are catering to people who have money to spend.
Exactly.
There's no way that that's not good. Okay. Now, so progress is happening, but who's going to benefit and who's going to be hurt by the progress?
Mm-hmm.
And what responsibility does the city have
Mm-hmm.
to manage the process of gentrification so as to communicate clearly to the people who are going to be displaced that this is progress, and to the extent that it comes at your expense, we want to make sure that this is progress for all of us.
Right.
Okay. Now, what that means in terms of practical program, I'm not sure. But if a renter has got to leave at the end of his lease and move
Mm-hmm.
to someplace else, they've got to move. They've got to pay now maybe more rent than they would have had to pay before. And yet, city tax coffers are being inflated by the fact that property that previously had been worth 300,000 is now worth 1.3 million, and the
Mm-hmm.
city is getting 3% or 6% a year, whatever it's getting in terms of property taxes and so forth. Doesn't that create the opportunity to say to the community through the political apparatus, look, we want gentrification. Don't fight gentrification. Come on, that's cutting your nose to spite your face. But
Mm-hmm.
we're all in this together. This process of change is one that we will see to the best of our ability redounds to the benefit not only of the newcomers but also of the incumbent residents who are being whose lives are being disrupted and so forth by this process. Easier for me to say than to do, but leadership that brought that kind of spirit to the process might be a more effective way than just kind of finger pointing or telling people get out of the way, the trucks are coming, and darn you, we bought you out, so the hell with you now.
The trucks are coming.
Yeah.
It's not
I
funny
mean,
at all.
that year that I visited at Columbia, 2010, 2011, and I lived in Harlem in a little apartment there on 113th Street near Malcolm X Boulevard. I saw this happening in real time, man, because I saw on the
Mm,
I was told that there was an open air heroin market on the very street that I had been living at 10 years earlier.
I remember that. Yeah,
Okay,
you said that. Yeah,
that market was gone, replaced by people who were speaking various European languages, Italian and Spanish and
Boston.
German and
Yeah.
whatnot, who were working somewhere in Upper Manhattan, and who were very glad to be living within a stone's throw of Central Park,
Hmm.
and right next to a subway station. In a old thing that had been redone and made into something really swanky and cool and hip. They were
Hmm.
very, very glad. But right across the street, there was a public housing project. And the bodega down on the corner in the store that was right there on the corner underneath the building was filled with people who looked like, I don't know if they were homeless. I don't know. There was a lot of food stamp traffic going on in
Right.
the market that was close by. Clearly, it was a mixing, transitioning,
Right.
dynamic process.
Hmm.
And, you know, it can't be bad that the heroin market is closed down. It can't be bad that people who are prepared to spend $500,000 bought an apartment and are redoing it. That's got to be good. But I could see the possibility that someone who was on the outs in that neighborhood,
Yeah.
watching it rise like a phoenix from the ashes, would
Yeah.
think, man, I've been living here 30 years and nobody ever gave a damn until these white people started coming.
You know what? And I would feel the same way. Yeah. I mean, you're sitting there. Let's say you're one of the people who's, buying something with food stamps from that store, and I can picture exactly what neighborhood, what part of the neighborhood you're talking about. And then here's this couple, two people named something like, Jamie and Clyde. And they're these white people, they're about 34, and they've got the big expensive carriage, and they're taking it up the steps into this now beautifully renovated brownstone. And you can't help thinking, if you're that person down in the bodega, who are you? And why is it that, it requires you coming here to make this a safer and nicer neighborhood? And it doesn't matter how nice Clyde and Jamie are to everybody else. It seems like they're interlopers, kind of clueless. They're not really part of this. And this, even though there was as much of it you didn't like as you liked, you loved your this. You figured at least we have this, and especially if
Right.
it's Harlem. And now the this is ending because Starbucks is not this. Or more concretely, we can't play drums on Saturday morning in the park because now these white people are coming up complaining that they want to sleep on Saturday morning. And that's a
Oh,
tough
I know
cultural.
that story. I know that from a couple of years ago, someplace in Harlem,
Yeah,
exactly. Some park where they used to gather on Saturday and
Mount
have their drum
Morris.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's a tough, tough question. I don't think there's any
Oh, do
easy
you know?
answer.
I got to
But
tell you
I
this.
I don't think that what you described, that good way of doing it, that way of being inclusive. To tell you the truth, Glenn, I don't think that there's a certain contingent, and I don't mean the poor person in the bodega. I mean often the Spike Lee or the person who is educated in watching this. I don't think they could be satisfied. I think that we'll talk about the visceral aspect. That seems to be our theme for today. There's a part of it that you just can't help hating if you're a certain kind of person. I sensed some of the feedback I got from my Spike Lee piece, the love and the hate, was some of the most intriguing I've ever had in terms of my trying to get a sense of where people are. And there's a certain kind of person, usually black, whose response to something like this is basically that you must tell the country that racism is institutional. If your response to this is not to get up on the box and underline that racism is institutional, you're not responding intelligently to an issue such as gentrification. And my thought is, well, aren't there enough people saying that all the time? What good would it do for me to take out my bullhorn and say that once
Okay,
again?
John, that's you. But here's what I want to say. I asked my son about the Google bus controversy.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
right.
now the Google bus controversy, if anybody doesn't know, is that Google out in San Francisco in the Bay Area has private buses that drive around and pick up its employees who are living scattered throughout the region and bring them to the, Google Central and Silicon Valley where they do their work, and then the buses take them home. They're private buses. So they would be cruising down the street. They may pull up at a bus stop or pull up in a service station parking lot or whatever, pick up the Google employees, and then take them off somewhere while other people who are living in the same, and some of these are mixed neighborhoods, are standing by watching the Google employees get on the Google bus while they may still be waiting for the San Francisco city bus to come along and so forth and so on. So there's
Mm-hmm.
resentment. So I asked my son who's a graduate of Columbia University and whose girlfriend is a San Francisco resident, so he goes out to visit her from time to time. I asked him about the Google bus controversy, and then we got to talking, and basically he said, "What's the problem, Dad? Google has buses; they pick people up. If you work at Google, you get on the bus. If you don't, you don't. What's the problem?" Okay. He says, when you're standing at the airport waiting to go to a hotel, some of the hotel or to a rental car company, you know what I mean? The private buses come by and they pick up the people who are doing business with them and they leave the other ones waiting for their buses to come by. He didn't get the problem. So then I started talking about gentrification and I told him about this thing. He says, again, gentrification is good, right, Dad? I said, yeah, but suppose that you had been come and play the conga drums, man, and have your, thing where you do your African drums and everybody's dancing and singing and chanting and whatnot, and they've been doing that for years, and then suddenly white people move in and they tell you can't do it anymore. He said, Dad, they're just the people playing the drums are disturbing the peace. Suppose somebody pulled up in front of our house right here and started playing drums. How'd you feel about that? So he had no sympathy whatsoever for any corner of what I was trying to say about black people on the bottom and white people on the top, and
Right.
he doesn't give a darn about it.
Well, he's going to catch hell when he starts airing views like those to people other than you and his girlfriend. So I'd be interested to see how he comes
John,
out of it.
his girlfriend's Chinese American.
I was kind of guessing that she was not black, if I may. And
No
yeah, I
problem,
mean,
man. No
I know
problem.
that your son is brilliant, but that sort of thing, during his 20s, he's going to learn that there are people who think in other ways. And I'd be interested to know how he felt about issues like that when he was, say, 32. But we'll see.
Yeah, okay. Viewers of the Glenn Show, you should know that this is my son Nehemiah, my second younger son, not my son Glenn, whom you've seen before, who's a gay man and is very happy to probably. Well, let me not say what his position would be about that. Anyway, enough about me. John, I think we've got a conversation in the can here, and we should call it quits while we're still ahead of the game.
We did. I've got a PowerPoint I've got to finish. And so let's
Okay,
pick this up very soon.
we'll do.
And yeah, this was a good one. I'll be interested to read the responses.
Thanks a lot, John. Upload as soon as you can.
I will talk to you soon, Glenn.
Bye.
Bye.